Good afternoon and welcome. My name's Kieran Bow. I'm Honorary Secretary and Interim Joint President of the Surrey Law Society. Welcome all to another webinar and executive briefing. We have a range of courses available both online and in person, and this is one of a variety of webinars by way of update that are free of charge to SLS members over the course of the year. By way of update and what's forthcoming in terms of training events, we have a private client offering with, I believe, Leslie King, a review of current issues on the 4th of October. That date has been moved now to online rather than in person, and hopefully that means if you were not able to make it in person, it will now be available online on the 4th of October on account of forthcoming train strikes. In addition, next in the following weeks, we have pensions and life policies in the context of estate planning, another private client opportunity, and that it is coming up later in October as well. Particularly exciting is the SLS Legal Awards on the 12th of October. Hopefully we have the opportunity to catch up and see you at that event at G Live in Guildford, and that should be a great evening at a brand new and exciting venue. For all other programs, please do check out the website in terms of both social, CPD, and webinar and training events. What I would say in terms of housekeeping is during the course of this webinar, if you would like to ask Bruce a question during the webinar, please use the raise your hand function. I will keep an eye on attendees. So hopefully, Bruce, you can focus on delivering the webinar and interject as necessary. And there will also, of course, be an opportunity to ask Bruce some questions at the end of this webinar. I think it's important to just note that this webinar is recorded, and copies will be available to attendees and to those who have signed up but unable to join contemporaneously. Cybersecurity is really something that's really important for any business in terms of risk management and contingency. From my perspective, it seems hardly a week goes by where dubious email comes through from a cloned email or someone seeking contact details or purporting to be a colleague or ex-colleague. I was only speaking to someone from an insurance company or an insurance broker who admitted quietly that their systems were down for over 48 hours as a result of a form of cyber attack. People don't always share what happens in terms of potentially reputational issues and risk management in their businesses. And I think sometimes it can feel, whether it's spurious emails or other reasons, that really from an IT perspective we sometimes are under attack. But Bruce is here to share tips regarding findings of the cybersecurity report that has recently been republished, what it means for SME law firms, and what actions we can be taking to defend ourselves from those operational and potentially reputational risks. That's enough for me, and Bruce, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kieran. Thanks for setting the scene so well there. Right, so just for those who don't know, the NCSC's National Cybersecurity Centre is a government-funded body, and they are essentially responsible for keeping the UK safe from cybercrime. But there's a really sort of heavy focus on keeping businesses safe from cybercrime, and they're also there to respond to major cyber incidents as well. Okay, so just a quick introduction to me. So I'm the Managing Director of ProDrive IT. We're an IT services business, and we provide, as well as IT management support for our clients, we produce IT strategies, which includes covering cybersecurity services, cloud management as well. And we do that obviously for the legal sector, also for accountancy, financial services companies as well. So I always tend to start off these presentations with a few sort of what I call scary slides, and I make no apologies for doing so, but it's really just to kind of set the context for why we're talking about in the following slide is so important. Now, these statistics have come out of the NCSC report, and as you can see, review last year, about a third of the businesses that the government reviewed were reporting being a victim of a cyber attack. And there's some numbers there that's associated with it as well. They seem quite low to me, but still, it's a costly experience. And as we'll talk about later, it's not just the sort of direct cost that's the problem. Slightly more worrying is that an SRA review found that 3/4 of the firms that they spoke to were actually victims of cyber attacks. So it seems like it's more prevalent cybercrime in the legal sector than in businesses in general. And here's some case studies. Now, 3 of these are mentioned in the report. One of them, the Swinburne, Snowball and Jackson ones, actually come out after the report was published. As you can see, they are from a little while ago. It tends to take a while before the authorities review these incidents. But I want to sort of draw your attention to a couple of things. Firstly, the first 2 case studies on there, both these companies incurred the wrath of the Information Commissioner's Office. So there was some kind of action taken, in one case a fine, in another case a reprimand. The 4 New Square one actually is, in some respects, it's actually a better example, or it's a better outcome, even though the fact that it has been recognised publicly, because it was recognised that they actually took very good contingency actions for cyber attack, and therefore they were able to respond very effectively, even though it was quite a significant attack. I guess the main thing with all these cases is, as you can see, all these are published on the internet, either on the Information Commissioner's Office, various cybersecurity websites or legal journals, and reputation is obviously a really key thing for law firms. So it's better to avoid this kind of situation where the public will find out that you've been involved in a cyber attack if you possibly can. So it's just putting some context to this. So why are law firms considered to be such a target? As we saw earlier, there seems to be a higher rate of cyber attack against law firms than businesses in general. And the report points out sort of 5 key areas really as to why this is the case. First, it's about the data that law firms hold. So data is a really valuable commodity. It's like gold dust for cyber criminals, and particularly sensitive data, sensitive personal data, or data that's related to litigation, or data relating to IP. All these things are really valuable for a cyber criminal. They can either use them for extortion, they can use it to influence cases that are going on, or they can use them for extortion of potentially your clients as well. We'll talk a bit more about that later. Obviously, law firms, fee earners are paid quite a lot of money in law firms, and so therefore the cost of disruption is significant. So if a cyber criminal was to be able to bring down your IT systems, we've seen that a lot with ransomware attacks, then there's a higher likelihood, in their view, that the law firm is going to pay the ransom fees than another business. Financial transactions. So where large financial transactions are involved, cyber criminals are usually present as well. So obviously law firms, there's quite significant opportunities there for financial fraud involving cyber criminals. And particular, and we'll get onto this again later as well, where there's small law firms who maybe don't have the resources that larger firms have to protect against cyber attack, but there are still significant financial transactions. These are considered a real target. So it's important to understand that just because you may have a fairly small firm, that you're not actually an attractive target. In fact, in a lot of cases, you're a more attractive target to a cyber criminal than a larger firm. And that's one of the other points actually that the National Cybersecurity Centre make, that there's a lot of smaller law firms out who just don't have the financial resources or the governance in place to put the controls against cybercrime within their organization. And so therefore they're becoming a much more attractive target. The final one I mentioned earlier, reputation is important. If a cyber criminal thinks that they've got something either in possession of data or information that could damage your reputation, they believe there's an opportunity for extortion there. The one thing I should also just point out as well, it's not mentioned specifically in the report as to why law firms are a target, but it is mentioned more in general, is this concept of supply chain attacks. So law firms hold lots of information on their clients. If you're a cyber criminal, you've potentially got opportunities to extort other companies as well as the firm that you're attacking. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So why are things getting worse? So the report specifically says that cybercrime in general is becoming a bigger problem. It's becoming a bigger problem, therefore it's becoming a bigger problem for law firms as well. There's two main reasons that they mention in there. The first is this fairly new concept of cyber attack tools as a service. So very much in the same way that you can go online, sign up to a new piece of software just by putting a credit card in, creating some login details, and you're up and running. You can do something similar now with cyber attack tools. So what's happening is large criminal gangs and less scrupulous nations are effectively creating a software industry for writing cyber attack tools. So rather than getting their income from doing the attacks themselves, they've now taken to writing the software and effectively selling the software to smaller cyber criminal gangs, individual criminals, even hobbyists who take a subscription out for the tools, and they might pay, upfront, or they might pay like a percentage of a ransom fee in order to be able to use those tools. Because these tools are now so readily available, and of course, even for an individual cyber criminal, all you need really is a computer to get started. This has really led to an exponential increase in the number of cyber criminals, cyber attacks out there. And some of these are using quite sophisticated tools now. These aren't just people sitting there sending out emails and, sort of throwing mud at the wall, so to speak. We've also got hybrid working. Of course, that's nothing new. A lot of firms are doing it and have been for some time. And whilst practices for remote working have improved a lot, there are still a couple of inherent sort of issues there, and cyber criminals are quick to exploit these, obviously, and have adapted their attacks to do so. So I'm just going to go back to a slide that I showed, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, for an SLS webinar I did on home working, remote working. This was during COVID, and there were 5 points that I mentioned there that result in, home workers or people working from home being more vulnerable than those in the office. Now, a few of those have sort of gone away now. Most of us are more familiar with those systems. Firms have, by and large, updated their IT to work for remote working. And this sort of concept of people trying to budget with free software has generally gone away. However, there's 2 points on there that still are totally valid today. Firstly, our home IT networks are not well secured. And in fact, it's probably less secure now than they were a couple of years ago when I put this slide together, because we have all sorts of smart devices, most of which have no cybersecurity built in, sitting around. And then we introduce a business laptop into that environment. The second issue, and this is the one that cyber criminals are really exploiting the most, is the lack of the less communication between people working from home and those in the office. So if you see something that you think may be slightly suspicious, but you're not really too sure, a lot of the time it's easier when you're working from home just to carry on working than to disturb someone. Whereas in the office, you might, speak to the person next to you or on the desk opposite you and just say, look, I've got this email. Was that you that sent that, or that kind of thing? So it's easier to check up and when you're in the same office environment. So this problem still kind of exists. So who's behind all these attacks? So the report points to sort of 4 categories of person, really, or 4 categories of cyber criminal. So the first ones are the actual criminals themselves. So these people are usually financially motivated. They're looking to steal money through financial fraud, intercepting payments, that kind of thing, or extortion. Extortion is the one we all know is ransomware. It's pretty easy to do, and we talked about the free, the easy availability of attack tools earlier. And there's also this concept now that's coming in as people marketing themselves as hackers for hire. So a bit like a sort of cyber crime sort of hitman, who, you know, do the dirty work for someone else, really. So this is probably by far the most common attack vector, if you like. You've also got insiders, so the disgruntled member of staff is the one that's usually highlighted here, but it could be that staff are unwittingly becoming causing the issues within your business by you know, sharing things, social media, that kind of stuff, and as a result, you're getting attacks from that information being shared. So I talked about nation states earlier, and you might think, well, why would a nation state be attacking my law firm? You know, what interest would they have? So they're probably not so much interested in a firm, but if you were to deal with clients who might be of interest to maybe a less scrupulous state, then potentially you could be the target, because they'll be looking to get information on those clients. So examples might be defense. We saw examples of this in the pharmaceutical industry when the COVID vaccines were being developed. Anything really that has some valuable intellectual property. So if you're involved with clients who are in those areas, then you could be considered to be a target for some of these businesses out there, particularly if it's kind of really obviously published on your website, for instance. And finally, we've got this concept of hacktivists. So essentially an activist, someone who's motivated by a cause, you know, it might be an environmental activist, for instance. And again, it's probably more that they're less interested in your firm as such, but more the clients that you have. So I mentioned, for instance, oil. If you dealt with a lot of oil and gas businesses in there and it was really obvious that you did, you might be seen as complicit by a hacktivist, or they might be looking at you as an opportunity of being able to attack your clients. So you're probably all familiar with the various different types of attack. I'm going to go through them briefly, but not spend too much time on them, because I'm sure you've heard these in other training webinars and that kind of thing. So phishing attacks, we're probably most familiar with those. I think it's still the case that over 3/4 of successful cyber attacks originate from phishing attack of some kind, usually email. They take various forms. Email's the obvious one, but increasingly we're starting to see these types of attacks through text message, WhatsApp message, even Teams. There's been some vulnerabilities published in Teams recently which allow phishing attacks through it. And there's a phone-based version of this as well, which I think is called vishing, but it's a similar sort of principle. All of these attacks are trying to get people to disclose information such as passwords, bank details, that kind of things, through tricking them by making them click on something that looks like it's a valid link, but takes them to some kind of malicious website. Business email compromise, slightly different. This is when someone's using email to impersonate another person. That can be via technical techniques to impersonate email, so registering a domain name. So that's a bit after the @ in your email address and making it very, very slightly different so it looks the same. Or potentially they've compromised one of your firm's email accounts and they're using a genuine email, and they're using those email addresses to then trick people again into disclosing information. This is a very common technique used in financial fraud. And one of the things as well that really kind of makes this a lot easier for law firms is very, very frequently law firms publish details of quite often their partners, sometimes all the fee earners, sometimes the support staff as well, on their websites. And that information includes quite often email addresses, sometimes direct phone numbers, sometimes even mobile phone numbers, and often you get a profile of that person as well. So if a cyber criminal is wanting to impersonate someone in your firm, they've got all the information they need there to do that. It's quite often the case that LinkedIn is used in these attacks as well. They're often targeted. with LinkedIn, cyber criminals can see when new staff join your firm, can see the roles of those staff as well, and some more information that will help them impersonate them. Passwords are really kind of, when it comes to cybersecurity, they are really one of the real core problems. They don't work very well. People can't remember passwords, and then they do things with them that end up leading to account being compromised. Typical problems with passwords include weak passwords, so not enough characters, reusing passwords in multiple systems. So if you use your password in more than one bit of software or website, that could potentially be a real problem. And then sharing them or writing them down in Word documents and storing them on a computer. Even now, storing them in web browser password managers. So if the password manager you get as part of Google Chrome or Microsoft Edge, for instance, they're pretty insecure as well. And there are attacks that are very easy to extract those passwords out of the web browser. So all those issues with passwords, as soon as someone has a password, then they've got the opportunity to compromise your accounts. And even with multi-factor authentication, which we'll talk about in a bit, there are ways around that as well now that are quite commonly deployed. Ransomware attacks were traditionally known as something you would click on a malicious link and then all your files would get encrypted and you'd have to pay a fee to get access to them again. They're much more sophisticated than that these days. So on a typical ransomware attack, the sort of build up to that, from the compromise to the actual attack happening, can now be quite a long period of time, potentially up to 200 plus days. We've certainly seen incidents where it's actually longer than that. And what happens now, typical attack, is someone will click on something in an email or maybe a compromised website or something, and a bit of software will end up on their computer, and they probably won't, in many cases, this won't be picked up by anti-malware, because cyber criminals have got very good techniques, often using artificial intelligence now, of avoiding those systems. And it deploys what's known as something called some command and control software. This is essentially like remote control software for your IT system for cyber criminals. And they'll then really go unnoticed for some period of time, essentially auditing your systems, looking for things. And the type of information they're looking for is administrative accounts and the passwords to go with those, because obviously they get greater access if they have that. They'll be looking for your financial information, so sets of accounts, that kind of thing. The reason they're looking for that is so they know what kind of level to set a ransom at when it gets to that point, assuming it does. They'll be looking for information on your cybersecurity, because they'll be trying to work out ways to disable it. They'll be looking for information on your backups, because if they can disable your backups from working, then they've got a better case for a ransom at the end of it, because you won't be able to recover your data. And the final thing they'll be doing is they'll be looking for sensitive information, data on your systems, IP, all the things I talked about earlier. Once they've found that information, they'll upload copies of that to their system as well, and they'll use that as part of the extortion at the end of it. So it's a much more complex process now, but because of the availability of these tools, which I mentioned earlier, to common criminals, you don't need a really complex cyber criminal gang behind it to deploy this kind of attack these days. The final thing is these concepts of supply chain attacks. So as I mentioned earlier, cyber criminals now, they're less interested in attacking larger enterprise firms, whilst in the past they might have given them a better sort of reward to the effort they're putting in. Tends to be that larger firms now have really, really good cybersecurity in place. They've got significant cybersecurity budgets, and therefore it's going to be much harder for a smaller cyber criminal gang or a lone cyber criminal to compromise one of those firms and get some kind of reward for it, be it through extortion or financial fraud or whatever. So it's much more attractive for them now to target a smaller firm who holds lots of data on other firms as well, because then through the concept of going through the supply chain, potentially extorting all those firms, in this case, maybe the law firm and then a number of your clients, they can still get a significant return on their efforts but it's actually easier in the first place because the firm they're attacking has a lower cybersecurity budget. We're certainly well aware of this, by the way, in the IT industry. We've been, because we obviously hold the keys effectively to a lot of our client systems. So we've been considered a supply chain target, probably the #1 supply chain target for quite a long time. And we've had to put very, very significant amounts of investment in to address this. But obviously cyber criminals now, they're expanding that beyond IT companies and looking at lots of professional services companies as well. And law firms are definitely on the radar there. Okay, so enough of the bad news, I guess. Moving on from that, the report does mention obviously some of the things that firms should be doing to protect themselves against cyber attack. And the first point really is talking about governance and management of this cyber risk. So it's really important that cybersecurity is seen as a board level subject. It's discussed at partner meetings, and budget is put aside to deal or to put in place controls against cyber attack. So I can't stress enough that it needs to be, you need to lead from the top in your firm and to create this culture of being a cyber safe firm. We do sometimes, unfortunately, see both law firms and other businesses where the most senior people decide to exclude themselves from some of the policies and the controls that are in place for the rest of the organization because they feel they don't want the restrictions that some of these controls create. Unfortunately, of course, not only does that set the wrong example for the rest of the organization and make it very difficult to create the culture, but actually those people are probably some of the biggest targets for cyber criminals. So the best way to really go about starting to get some systems in place in your organization is to probably look at some of the standards that are out there, some publicly available standards. I've not put all of them on here, but these are some of the more common ones in the UK. I suspect most people on the call have heard of Cyber Essentials. Hopefully most of you have it in your firm. I believe it's a requirement of the current Lexel standard as well. What I should say is that there's 2 levels of Cyber Essentials, Standard and Plus. The actual standard is the same, but the Plus version is audited by an external auditor. Now, what I'd say is in terms of providing confidence to your clients, really, I'd say that you should be looking at the Plus now as a minimum. The reason for that is there's a lot of fraudulently issued certificates of Cyber Essentials. The actual certificate has been genuinely issued, but they've been essentially people are putting the assessments in and lying about what they have. And because it's a self-assessment, there's no way of checking that for the certification bodies out there. So really, if you want to give that assurance, you should be looking at the auditor's assessment. IASME Cyber Assurance, whereas Cyber Essentials, by the way, is about your technical controls that you have in place. IASME Cyber Assurance and IASME are the organization behind Cyber Essentials that administrate it. So they have this other standard as well. And IASME Cyber Assurance is about having the policies, procedures, governance in place in your organization around cybersecurity. And it's a really, really useful standard. Similar in some ways to the next one on the list, ISO 27001, but it's much more obtainable for an SME business. It's quite prescriptive, which could be seen as being restrictive to a larger organization. But for an SME business, it makes it much easier to obtain because it's very black and white what you need to do to get there. You've probably heard of ISO 27001 as well. It's almost like a bit of a combination of Cyber Essentials and IASME Cyber Assurance. However, there's a lot of additional governance in place around it. So you have to have, it mandates regular reviews, internal boards to manage it. My understanding is it's somewhere between about sort of 70 to 90 days of someone's time a year to maintain this if you're doing it properly. So really, for a smaller firm, it's quite a jump. Having said that, some smaller firms operate in particularly sensitive areas, like if you operated in defence, you might have that. The final one on here is Cyber Assessment Framework. So this is something published by National Cybersecurity Centre. It's freely available on their website. If you Google it, you can go in there. It's a framework. It's not actually, there's no assessment, there's no certificate issued for it, but it's a framework for organisations who are in, so a good example, that ones that supply essential services to business, so like energy company or a cloud hosting provider, one of these sort of people, they're actually regulated and have to comply with the Cyber Assessments Framework. I'm not saying that people on this call should go and comply with that, but it's a really useful guideline, and there's 3 kind of different maturity levels that are stated in there. So it's worth looking up and just to get some ideas as to how you can implement better governance around cybersecurity in your organization. Some more specific things, email. So I mentioned earlier, 75% I think of cyber attacks start from a phishing email. About 90% in total start from some kind of email. So really, when it comes to cybersecurity controls, technical controls, starting at email and certainly investing as much as you can in email security is a really, really good thing to do. So what does that look like? I guess most of you have email security. Making sure you've got a premium email security in place, not the basic one, is a good starting point. You should be training people on what bad emails look like, and that has to be regular training, by the way. So just to sort of put a case in point, hopefully you'll all learn a bit today, if you've done the job right. But 4 weeks down the line, if you're having a really busy day, trying to balance several cases, the phones are ringing a lot, will you remember specific things about this? Probably not. So, and certainly not in 6 months' time. So really, you should be doing this sort of training on a regular basis. Obviously, you can't do training that's maybe an hour-long webinar on a regular basis, but having small amounts of what we call reinforcement training is the best or the recommended way of doing that. And that will include sending sort of simulated phishing emails, that kind of stuff as well. And the final thing really is impersonation protection. So there's different ways of doing this. There's something called DMARC, which is something to speak to your IT people about and make sure your email is being set up with that. And there's various takedown services, as they're known, out there. And this is for when you find someone who's created a domain name that's similar to yours and they're trying to use that to impersonate you. You can employ one of these takedown services to try and actually get that domain name taken off and made unavailable again. I won't linger too much on updating software. Hopefully you all know about this. You should be applying software updates, not just to Windows, but all your software. If you're using phones or tablets to get any sort of, for any business purpose, that includes email, you should be making sure that they are always up to date as well. Multi-factor authentication, I mentioned earlier. So hopefully everyone has that. I think most organizations now have that in place. However, there's a few things to point out. Firstly, what was good practice for multi-factor authentication a couple of years ago is now not the best way of doing it. So what I mean by that was cyber criminals, once some kind of new technology comes on the market to prevent cyber attacks, they'll find a way around it. So there's many techniques to avoid multi-factor authentication or to get around multi-factor authentication for a cyber criminal now, including setting up fake websites on the internet that impersonate, if you like, where you used to put the codes in. So the best practice now, if you've got a system that's available that will do it, is to have what's called number matching. So the multi-factor system will put a number on the screen of your computer, your phone buzzes with an app on there, and then you have to put the number into your phone that's on your computer screen. So it makes it much harder for a cyber criminal to impersonate. Now that's available on Microsoft. So if you haven't got it on your Microsoft 365, you should really be upgrading to have that in place. It's usually part of all the plans on there. You'll probably find that a lot of software systems, case management systems, that kind of thing, haven't sort of upgraded to that kind of level yet, but they should all be doing it in time. We mentioned passwords earlier. The simple solution to the problem with passwords is to have a password manager. If you've got as many passwords as I have, or even half as many, you're never going to be able to remember them. it's very much the case for most people these days. And the only real solution, other than writing them down on a piece of paper, which has its own problems, is to use some password management software. There's lots out there, some potentially better than others, but really it's something you should have in place in your organization. And finally, we talked about the supply chain attacks a couple of times, and that law firms could be subject to one of those. Equally, you could end up getting attacked from an attack on your supply chain as well. Hopefully, you've checked out the security credentials of any IT companies you're using, made sure they've got the certificates we spoke about earlier. But any other key sort of suppliers, software suppliers, that kind of things, you should be making sure you audit these and create a record that you've done the audits as well, because should you have a problem in the future and you need to, for example, claim on your insurance, you may be asked to provide evidence that you've checked the security of your suppliers. So the final thing I just want to talk about is that we have to accept these days that we are all likely to have a cyber attack. If you haven't had one, that's great, but you probably will have one at some point, or you may have had one already and not know about it. So the really important thing is that you manage to minimize the impact of the attack when it happens. So once you accept that you will have an attack at some point, and you think, okay, what can we do to respond as quickly as possible? And time really is of the essence when you have a cyber attack. The sooner you're able to mitigate the effects of it and to close off the attack and to deal with the fallout of it, the less impact it will have on your firm. So number one, you should have an incident response plan. That is a fairly easy to use plan that says what happens when you have a cyber attack. And that should be a lot more than just call IT, because there's a lot more to do there. Now, there's lots of examples of these. You can download them on the internet. I think we even have a video on the ProDrive website of how to write one. But essentially what it should do is say what the person using the computer immediately has to do. And so, of course, all your staff should have a copy of it, how you form a team to deal with that incident, and then who's contacted and how's that information dealt with. So I won't go into any more detail there, but absolutely the most essential thing should an attack happen. I'm guessing a lot of you have cyber insurance, which is great. There's a bit of a misconception about cyber insurance. So a lot of people who take it out believe they're taking it out because of the financial cover, for instance, paying out a ransom if that has to be paid out, or the kind of loss of productivity impact on the business, that kind of thing. Actually, the most critical thing about that a cyber insurance policy will provide you is the incident response element. So were you to have a cyber attack, one of the things that you really need straight away is really, really good forensic cybersecurity experts. Now, these are really specialized people. They come at quite a high fee, obviously, as you'd imagine, but you'll need these people to find out where the attacks come from, what the extent of it is, make sure that it has been stopped, find out the damage it's done. Now, these people have special tools, they have special training in order to be able to do this. And if you call your cyber insurers and say, we've had an attack, they'll have these people stood up for you very, very quickly indeed. And that's really critical. They'll also provide other assistance as well, such as marketing comms, if you need to communicate out some about what's happened about the attack, specialist lawyers as well who can help you. So cyber insurance is really invaluable in those scenarios. It's increasingly common now as well for a lot of firms to have security monitoring. So this is 24/7 monitoring. You might hear it called Security Operations Center but in the IT world. But this is looking for unusual patterns of behavior in your systems and investigating it if and when they occur. So it's become far more important now because cyber criminals have found many, many ways of getting around a lot of the antivirus, anti-malware tools that we have deployed in our IT systems. Say AI forms a big part of that as well, in that they're using AI to generate almost unique malware every time they're sending it out. So How do we see that once it's on the system? Well, a lot of the time we won't until it's too late. So using security monitoring, you can look for patterns of behavior that not expecting, for instance, data getting uploaded from your system during the night, that kind of thing, and hopefully identify some of these attacks before they cause too much damage. Finally, backups. If you're backing up your data securely, then if data is deleted or data is encrypted, you can get it back. It's the quickest way of getting back to business as normal. But you have to have secure backups. So it's not just a backup onto a hard disk or something isn't good enough. It needs to be on a separate system that's totally separated. We call it air gapped, if you like, from your IT system, with separate passwords that are held by separate people, because cybercriminals have become very, very competent now at disabling backups that can be reached from your IT system. So there's a difference between a backup and a secure backup. So with that, I'm just going to leave you with a couple of links. There's a link to the report on there. You can find it easily with a Google. Little bit of a plug for ProDrive here, but we've got a free security audit on our website, which is linked to there. Anyone who's on this webinar is welcome to sign up for that. So that's me done. I'm going to open up to questions now. So if you've got any, please, I think we're going to pop them in the chat. Is that right, Kieran?
They can either, hi there, that was really helpful and really informative, Bruce, thank you. I'm keeping an eye on the chat and also for any raised hands. But I was just thinking, one of the things that you touched upon was the importance of training, and what's the best approach if I want to introduce some training for my team? We're in private client and we've seen a significant uptick in attempts either for forged invoices or cloned emails. How would we generate an improved culture for awareness of potential risks?
Yeah, so I think there's two aspects that are really important to look at. Firstly, when you're bringing on new staff, it definitely needs to be part of the onboarding induction training. And as I mentioned earlier, new staff potentially are more likely to be exposed to cyber attacks because of the fact that you get these sort of business email compromise attacks, these impersonation attacks, and they're less likely to be familiar at that stage when they join the firm with the other people, the names of the other people in the firm, how those people behave, and therefore less likely to be able to spot, an impersonation email from someone else in the firm. So making sure that training is done really early on is critical. And the other aspect is this concept of reinforcement training. So people aren't going to remember a lot of this information for 6 weeks' time that I've provided today. There's too much. It's great for looking at what you're doing from a strategic perspective, but in terms of identifying a cyber attack, it's not really going to help that much. So there needs to be constant reinforcement training of what these attacks look like, potentially examples of them, what sort of behaviors you're looking for in emails, that kind of thing. So if you're going to do that, it needs to be short chunks of training. There's training services you can subscribe to, many of them now, and they'll deliver videos, every month or every couple of weeks. They'll deliver simulated phishing emails where, someone clicks on the link, it will provide a bit of training, and it also deliver a lot of information to your HR team about who's watching these videos, usually they have 1 or 2 questions after them, who's getting those questions wrong or right, who's clicking on links in the phishing emails. And from that, you can see if perhaps there's a need for some more targeted training as well for those people.
Thank you. No raised hands at the moment, but feel free to raise any questions. One of the things that has occurred to me is that there's been a definite shift from hosting software within firms, either on servers over to the cloud. Does the cloud offer greater security, or does it potentially provide more threat or more risk? What's the general consensus and view regarding that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So on one hand, by moving your software to the cloud, you're handing the security, if you like, cybersecurity of the hosting of that software over to a company that you would hope is more experienced in doing that and potentially has more resources to do that, although it is worth checking that out, which is why I mentioned auditing your supply chain earlier. But, you know, if you were using a large, well-known, reputable firm, you would hope that's happening. So there is certainly an advantage in that respect in doing that. However, the flip side of it is once your software is accessible over the internet, as most cloud software is, then you're potentially more vulnerable from the sort of login side of it and the user credentials, because anyone can go to that website, and if they have your username and password, and if you even if you have multi-factor authentication, if they've worked out a way of getting around that, then potentially you could get access to that data as well. So I think the other thing is just worth considering is that some firms that do move to the cloud think, well, that's great, my security is handled by these people now. So there isn't an element there of perhaps being a little bit complacent. So it certainly, and I mentioned Cyber Essentials earlier. Cyber Essentials was standard was modified recently to take account of this. So it didn't actually used to take any account of software hosted by other people when you were being audited. So their view originally was, well, that's the hosting company's responsibility. But now actually they did a revision of that. I believe it was, it came into effect in January, certainly in the last 12 months anyway. And now they've actually made that responsibility the responsibility of the company being audited. So if your firm is having Cyber Essentials audit, you have a certain element of responsibility for the cloud services that you've procured and you're using. They call it a sort of shared responsibility model. And there is a nice little chart actually somewhere on the Cyber Essentials website, which says who is responsible for what for each kind of type of software. So certainly you need to be on the case in terms of making sure that you've got the right controls around your cloud software, that your administrative accounts are locked down properly, you have multi-factor in place, people are using strong passwords, no one's sharing those passwords, all those elements which we've talked about earlier in this presentation.
Thank you. At my present firm, I'm fortunate in the sense that we have a relatively well-resourced IT department and help desk, etc. But if I'm in a smaller firm, are there any steps that I can take to ensure that my IT setup is secure? Yeah,
so there's a few things. Yeah, so Cyber Essentials, I think, is always probably one of the best starting points. It's a government designed framework for having a relatively secure setup, although it does, it covers the technical side of it. So from a people side, you still need to make sure that you're covering that as well, because the best technical controls can be undone in seconds by the actions of a person. I think making sure that you're having what you're doing audited by someone externally is really important, or that there's some kind of audit process in place. And the reason I say that is IT is a very fast moving world these days. Both the picture around cybercrime is changing rapidly, both the number of attacks and the way those attacks are conducted, the complexity of them, but also the software that businesses are using, software that firms are using is changing a lot. So I suspect a lot of people use Microsoft 365 here. Every month there's new features, huge numbers of new features released on Microsoft 365, which can potentially cause security issues. There's other changes you need to make that if you don't make them, they could cause security issues. So it's no good just setting up Microsoft 365 and then using it. You need to maintain it every month. And there'll be similar things for different bits of case management software, that kind of thing as well, although maybe not to the same extent as Microsoft. So you do need to be checking up on those systems regularly and to have someone to do it. It's not a huge amount of work if you're doing it on a regular basis and shouldn't be a huge cost. But if you don't do it for a long time, then potentially, the cost is going to be much higher, i.e. if you do have some kind of compromise.
Thank you, Bruce. We've got a question here from a participant, and it's actually it hits on a really important point, because I think it's something that many of us, if not all of us on this call or webinar, have seen. So I'll read the question through, but I think it's circumstances that, as I said, may be familiar. We've seen a couple of situations where clients have received correspondence purporting to be from us and requesting deposits, so presumably on conveyancing matters.
Mhm.
Luckily, we make clients aware at the outset of our bank details, and these will not change, and they have checked and identified the attack. However, their systems are secure, and it transpires that in cases other agents, other parties such as estate agents, have been hacked and emails have been intercepted in that way. Is there anything that we as lawyers can do about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think to a certain extent, this is similar to the points I was making around the supply chain attacks. And whilst, of course, the estate agents might not be someone you consider to be a supplier, they are kind of involved in that whole chain that you work in. And sometimes your reputation can be adversely affected by things that are effectively, from a sort of IT perspective anyway, outside of your control. And but it's not good enough to say, well, that was outside of our control, because you're relying on reputation for your business. So my suggestion would be that you ought, because there are various technical solutions which can help to a certain extent with this, but really none of them are going to solve this problem. The only thing that's really going to solve it is if everyone in the whole kind of chain here has good cybersecurity. So really, you should try to be auditing the people that you work with. So you should say, really, they should have cyber essentials as a minimum. I know it's difficult to do that because you might be cutting yourself out of business, but what's worse, not having that business or having a major sort of cyber attack that's nothing to do with you whatsoever, that affects one of your clients, and therefore your reputation is damaged. So at some point there has to be a kind of a decision on that. And it's, if you don't want to do it, it's potentially a risk that you've accepted. But what you'll see, and there's a lot of information about supply chain attacks, by the way, on the National Cybersecurity Centre website. And the reason for that is the government is absolutely terrified about the cost and the potential cost of this on business in general. And what they're trying to do is to get people to get in the habit of auditing their supply chains, because only when that starts to happen, and when people say, actually, I'm not going to do business with you if you're not a secure organization, will the general level of cybersecurity go up across businesses in the UK. So it's a really difficult one, and there's no simple solution, or there's no easy solution, I guess, that's necessarily palatable for everyone. But you have to, at some point, make some decisions in your firm as to who you're going to deal with and who you're not going to deal with on the basis of these things potentially happening.
Thank you. Really helpful. And it is a difficult one, isn't it, in terms of, do we dictate which estate agents we deal with, for example, or other third parties? But I guess that the overall consensus is that there needs to be a general, and forgive the term, leveling up of IT security across the board. We have a question from Sushila. So Sushila, I think if you're able to.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bruce, for the presentation. I was just hearing what you were saying about Kieran talking about estate agents, etc. It's not only estate agents. We have loads of it coming out from solicitors. So we're supposed to be cybersecurity. We seem to be in a very difficult situation where they constantly still send stuff by email. I mean, we are very careful here. We will not accept it. But what do you do when, and then they get very upset about this. So there's really not a whole situation where everyone's doing the same thing. And we get this constantly from the larger firms, not yours, Kieran, I'm not talking about you. The other, I call this the conveyancing bucket shops. This is a constant problem we face. And it's not easy for small firms, but and the more when we say these things, the type of emails we get back, it's not very, very nice and helpful. So we do have those difficulties. And I really don't know. All that we can do is keep shouting out and saying we won't accept it, but how long can you go? And what's gone on now is the cybersecurity premium, so the insurance have gone up by another 500 quid because of these problems of the number of claims that are being made, and the what you're getting back from that, the exclusions have become higher now. So we are actually being in a very, very difficult situation.
So, Sheila, does your question relate in particular to sharing of account details, or is it broader information as well?
About account details.
Account details, thank you.
Yeah, and that's cybercrime. That's where this whole thing can go wrong, because if somebody just hacks into the system, they've had it.
Yeah. So two really good points you made there. So you're obviously doing the right thing, as I'm sure you know, by refusing to accept that information by email. You can actually set your email up so it automatically rejects when people, so it can look for what it sees as account details on there, and it will reject the email before it even comes into your system. So that provides a kind of additional level of protection for you. It doesn't stop the problem, of course, that you mentioned, that the firm you're dealing with is insisting that they send the information that way. There's no real solution to the problem, to be honest, other than what Kim was saying a few minutes ago about this sort of leveling up of cybersecurity, because those firms that are sending that, they're causing security issues, right? It's and only when there's enough pushback from other firms to say we're not accepting it for these reasons will they invest to change the way they're doing it. Because essentially the problem is with all cybersecurity controls, technical controls anyway, a lot of them, they don't save anyone time, right? You spend more money, but it makes work more difficult, right? So and that's kind of magnified, that cost that the larger your firm is as well. So there's going to be pushback against it, of course, but at the same time, unless we're all saying, look, this is what the minimum we accept, then people aren't going to change. I mean, there's some parallels here with the IT sector, right? So I mentioned earlier that we are the sort of number one target really for these supply chain attacks. And to your point on cyber insurance premiums, ours literally have doubled every year for about the past 3 or 4 years. So they're really very significant part of our operating costs now as a business. And we can't get a cyber insurance policy without going through a sort of 500-point checklist every year. So this might be, unfortunately, what's coming to other sectors, right? Because the cyber insurers had to pay out a lot in the IT sector. But that we've seen this over the past few years, so we've been experiencing it, and we're not able to deal with a firm that doesn't have good cybersecurity in place. Our insurance won't even allow us to do it. So most of the businesses now who are supplying the IT services sector have accepted that because they just won't get any business otherwise, and they've had to up their game as well. So it will get to that point, and actually the government's now regulating our sector. That regulation is going to come in place next year. It's going to start with I think firms over 50 seats, or I think it's 5 million turnover. But they're going to have to follow their cyber assessment framework, which I spoke about earlier, same way as, like, I don't know, an energy supplier would do. Because the government's realized they've got to just do something about it. They've got to say, right, from now on, it's actually, you can't legally operate unless you're at this standard. But we've already got to the point where other businesses who are operating in our sector realize now they've got to meet a certain standard, or they're not going to get any business. And I think that's the way it's going to have to go for the legal sector as well. There's going to have to be a certain accepted standard. I think in the US, there's regulation that's come in place, not specifically for the legal sector, but across all businesses for certain levels of cybersecurity now, and that things have to be in place in certain states anyway. And I suspect we'll end up going that way in the UK, but we're definitely some way behind on that front.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sushila. Thank you, Bruce. Bruce, one final question very, very quickly before we hopefully wrap up just on time at 1:30. Hopefully from the tips you provided, we are in a position where we don't suffer from a cyber attack. But if we do suffer from a cyber attack, or we are impacted, who do we need to report to? We're a regulated business and profession.
Yeah, so you should really, I mean, this is the incident response plan that where the incident response plan I mentioned earlier comes in. You should be doing an audit of everyone that you need to report to. So, you know, like to be SRA, if you're regulated by them, but there's going to be, you know, potentially the ICO as well, because there's personal data involved. There's requirements around that. Your insurer is almost certainly, if you've got insurance, probably need to report it to the police, although they're probably unlikely to do anything about it. But you should really have a list of everyone that you need to report this to. And as I said earlier, just having down there, let's call the IT people, is 100% not enough. You need to have all these people, or all these organizations you need to report to, recorded, and the times that you need to get reports to them. So, you know, there's deadlines, for instance, for the ICO. There probably will be with some of those others as well. And unless you've got that all documented, who's going to do the reporting documented, because it might be different people in your firm who report to different organizations, what you need to report to them. So it's really important that you have down the information that they need, and how to contact those people. And that should really be an easily accessible document. As I mentioned earlier, time is really very much of the essence in that kind of scenario.
Okay, thank you. We're just about to wrap up, but Sushila, you've raised
just
your
a very
hand.
quick one, Kieran. I just thought about this because some things has come up. You mentioned about, Bruce, you mentioned about protecting emails to a certain extent. I mean, obviously we can use the egress system or something like that to send our paperwork through, but not everyone uses it. And I use them because I have family work, we do that. But on conveyancing matters, you know, we are constantly, it's all digital platform now and everything. Yeah. So again, we are so prone as an organization, all firms, listed firms, prone to cyber attack because of all the information going out by emails these days. Yeah. You know, forms and all the transaction forms and even the forms that you do pre-completion, you know, all those things. So if you're saying there is a method we can protect those, I'd like to know what that method is, or maybe you can email it to us. I'm not taking your time now, but something can be put forward so that we can at least understand. Sorry to be a bother, but another issue I brought up.
There's no magic bullet, obviously. So sending all anything confidential by secure email is, or using a portal and directing people to it, the principles are the same in both scenarios, is absolutely essential. And you can put controls on that as well. So effectively your email system automates what's confidential or what goes by secure email, what doesn't. But the bigger problem is, I think, and that's really, you know, helping secure your clients as well. But one of the bigger problems is the impersonation you're getting, or the phishing emails that are coming through, which people mistake for other things, and that it's difficult to defend against this stuff. And whatever you do, it will still come through. But one of the things, for instance, you could move internal communication to another platform. So we've had to do that in our organization. We don't communicate internally on email. So if someone received an email from me asking for, I don't know, client's password, or, you know, to transfer some money or something like that, they'd know it wasn't me, because we don't use it for that. We use Teams in our business, but, you know, it could be Slack or some other platform. And we do our client communication via our service management system. So it's basically a bit like our case management system, but for IT services business. And we block the people who use that, aren't able to email clients from their, you know, from their Outlook, for instance. So there's things you can do about the way people work to try to reduce the impact of malicious emails and impersonation emails. And there's technical things which I mentioned earlier, and happy to share a bit more on email afterwards that you can implement. But there's no kind of one thing you can do, which is why I was saying it's worth, if you are investing in cybersecurity controls, focusing on email at the beginning is going to get you kind of the better sort of protection for your investment, really, because that's where there's so many sort of potential loopholes that cyber criminals can exploit.
Thank you very much.
Sushila, Bruce, thank you very much. Bruce, there's a lot to take back. It may be the case that people would want to reach out to you independently. What's the best way of contacting you?
So I think my email and LinkedIn were on the beginning of these slides.
I think they were.
I'm guessing they'll get distributed, will they? In which case people will have that information in there.
Which leads on to absolutely. So thank you very much, Bruce. That's been really, really helpful. Very interesting afternoon. The links to a recording of this webinar will follow in the next couple of days to all participants who have registered, and please do send any feedback to helen.opie, that's OPIE, at surreylawsociety.org.uk. Once again, thank you all for joining. Have a lovely afternoon, and thank you and good afternoon. Bye-bye.